I did good that time. Kept all of my papers in my Bible. I almost lost them. I really just did almost do it again. If you will, turn your Bibles to the book of Deuteronomy. It's wonderful to be here with you all this evening. And turned out to be quite a beautiful day. After like 70 degrees on Friday, then really cold again yesterday. It's just, the Midwest. What can you do? And also I realized, I was listening back on some sermons, doing some stuff on the YouTube, on adding some thumbnails and things. And I realized, all of my sermons start with, a weather report. So, sorry. I don't really need to, I'm not apologizing. But that was just, I used to actually really want to be a meteorologist. So maybe it's a little undertone there of a side passion of mine. But I was sitting by Quinn before we started the service tonight, and he mentioned how in the reading plan, we're also in Deuteronomy. And that was a good catch, because I actually just decided to do this within the past, at the beginning of February. I took the lesson at the first of the month from where we were at in the Read Through the Bible. And so I was like, why don't just the first of the month, throughout the rest of the year, wherever we're at on the reading plan, kind of draw a teaching and a lesson from there. So it's kind of just a way that I can come up with a sermon idea, and also to encourage you to, grab the reading plan, follow along throughout the year. There's still copies of it up here on the front, and you can hop in wherever, guys. It's the Bible, There's no bad spot to hop right in and start reading it. And right now it's the beginning of Deuteronomy, so it's the last book of the first 5 books of the Bible. And honestly, a great place to start, because Joshua, Judges, it kind of opens up into a new range, a next step in the story. So tonight, though, as on the screen, we'll begin in Deuteronomy chapter 1. And I just want to kind of outline the beginning of these first 11 chapters, because that's where we're going to be camping out, drawing the main points of the lesson. So here in Deuteronomy chapters 1 through 3, you get a little bit of Moses the historian. In the first 3 chapters, he goes through the whole history of the family of Israel up until the point of Deuteronomy. It's kind of like the story so far. And in that story, he begins with the Exodus. Now, I'll just kind of draw it on the board, because we're going to come back to this later, kind of more towards the end. But he talks how their history begins with the Exodus, when they were in bondage in Egypt. And I don't know, I'll just draw the chains of bondage in Egypt when they were shackled to Pharaoh. God liberated them out of that, brought them through the waters of the Red Sea, and then to the mountain of Sinai, where he entered into a covenant with them, and his cloud descended on that mountain, and he entered into a covenant here where they got the 10 Commandments. And then from there they wandered through the wilderness, and now where they meet, we run out of whiteboard, but this is the edge of the Promised Land, and that's where we're picking up with them in Deuteronomy. Is right there at the edge of the Promised Land. Moses goes up on a mountain, and he speaks to the children of Israel. And this is where all of Deuteronomy takes place. In fact, the Hebrew name for the book of Deuteronomy is just the words, because it's Moses speaking all these speeches to the children of Israel, trying to remind them of their history. And, we'll get to that again in a second, because he's trying to provoke them to remember. In the next 2 chapters, chapters 4 and 5, we'll look at how he calls on them to know who their God is. Remind them to know what their God did for them. From all of that history lesson, it's this is who your God is. Don't forget it. And then chapters 6 through 7, we keep going through, and that's where there's this famous prayer. And if you turn over to chapter 6, we'll read it, and we'll be coming back to all of this. I'm giving you an outline of the lesson tonight with these chapters here. Chapter 6, verses 4 and 5 is this famous prayer that still today, Jewish people will say this every morning and evening. It says, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. You shall love Yahweh your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your might." And that we'll come back to this. We're just laying the groundwork of where we're heading, what we're doing. But that word Shema is the same word that is used in verse 4. Hear, listen up, pay attention. Shema. And I've talked about it before, but review is good. So we'll come back to that in a minute. And then the last few chapters of this first section calls on them to remember. And it's kind of jumping back to what we began with, where he was reminding them of their history. And so then in chapters 8 through 11, it's then again this plea from Moses to remember. remember who their God is. So now diving into this book and these chapters here, starting way back into that first section. We won't go through the history part of chapters 1 through 3, but if you will go back to chapter 4, go to Deuteronomy chapter 4. Deuteronomy 4, and this is where we'll start in that section where he's calling on them to look at the history, reminding them of who God was, and then draw from that the conclusion of his character. Who has he shown himself to be, Yahweh their God? And look first in chapter 4 and verse 20. Chapter 4, verse 20. Moses says, "But Yahweh has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace from Egypt to be a people for his own inheritance, as today." So firstly, God is their deliverer. He's the one that brought them out of the fiery furnace of Egypt. That great act of deliverance in the Exodus when he rescued them from the bondage of Pharaoh out of there into freedom. And this phrase is repeated multiple times later on, and specifically in the prophets. They pick up this phrase of, "I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt." In fact, the Exodus is the most referenced event in the Old Testament, in the whole Bible, the Exodus. And what God is saying in that moment is, it's kind of like, here's a silly example. Robert was even teasing me this morning in class I mentioned many times before, I was a terror. I was quite a terror as a child, and well, that's just, as a young boy is. But there's these moments where like you're behaving in a certain way, and the parents they pull rank, right? They're like, "Whose house are you under? Like who gave birth to you?" If it's your mother, and this is kind of like that kind of phrase, right? God is saying, "I am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Like I'm the one who rescued you. Like, don't forget that. Remember that. And what does that show? But that he is their deliverer, their rescuer. I mean, even when we talk about birth, it's a delivery. And that's what the Exodus was for Israel. They came up through the waters and were delivered. They were a new people, a new holy nation to God. He is their deliverer, their rescuer out of that burning fiery furnace of Egypt. And so a little fiery furnace there. Any other stories in the Bible about a fiery furnace being rescued from? Anyways, go meditate on your own time on that one. But then in verse 24, look down now in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 24. It says, "For Yahweh your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God." Now on that mountain, when God's presence, the glory presence, descended in Exodus 19, if you want to go read it sometime, not right now, read it later. Meditate on your time. But in Exodus 19, when God's presence descended on that mountain, it was like a cloud. It looked like a cloud, but the cloud had a fire inside of it. It's like there was a glowing, fiery, it's a dense gloom surrounding his glory presence, but in the midst of that cloud was fire. In fact, it looked like to the Israelites when Moses walked out there that he just like went into the fire and it's like, well, guess he's done. And then 40 days they wait for him, and you have that tragic story, which is actually the picture on the screen of the golden calf. While Moses is up on the mountain with God, speaking to him, receiving the commandments, the Israelites are breaking the commandments at the foot of the mountain. And so God, our God, is a consuming fire, a jealous God. And y'all are in Hebrews, I believe, still at here. That's a little Hebrews 12:29 reference. The Hebrew writer quotes this. But I want to talk about that word jealous for a second as well, because often, at least when I hear the word jealous today, it almost is synonymous with envy. Like I see someone with something that I don't have, and then I'm jealous of that thing that they have. That's not at all what this word means here in the text. God is not envious, or he's somehow insecure about something. This word it means like, say for example, if you're married to someone and you see your spouse talking to someone of the opposite sex, and you catch them talking to them, and you're jealous for them. Is that bad to be jealous for your spouse? No, it is not. In fact, another way to kind of think about this is God is a passionate God. Because they're about to enter a land, they're about to enter that promised land off the whiteboard, where there's lots of other nations that worship other gods. Those other gods, they're going to be alluring. They're going to be calling out to the Israelites, trying to tempt them away from Yahweh their God. He's trying to say, hey, God's a consuming fire. He's passionate for you. Like he wants you to be his. Don't leave him. Because As the Hebrew writer concludes, it's a dangerous thing to fall into the hands of a living God, after he quotes this verse as well. But along with that, God is consuming fire, and he's passionate, he's jealous. Look down at verse 31. Because he's their deliverer, right? They saw his passion and his fire poured out on Pharaoh as he was abusing his people and his children, as he calls them in the Exodus story, his firstborn son, Israel. But also, he delivered them, right? He's their rescuer. Look at verse 31. For Yahweh your God is a compassionate God. He will not fail you, nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant with your fathers, which he swore to them. Both of those are held together in Yahweh God. Passionate, fiery, like dangerous, but he's also loving, compassionate, tender, merciful. He won't forget you, and he won't forget the covenant that he brought you into at Sinai. Like be faithful to him. Like all of this is Moses like pleading with the Israelites to be faithful to God. So that's the first section, knowing who Yahweh is. He is their deliverer. He is passionate, jealous, but he is also compassionate. And he's loving, and he's loyal. And do not forget who he is. And so now on to that next section. If you will, turn just a couple pages over to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6. We read this just a second ago. But here in Deuteronomy chapter 6, and in verse 4, we'll read it again. Because this is kind of like, this is the center of this section of chapters, of the intro to Deuteronomy where Moses is speaking. Right here, the heart is the heart. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 6, let's start reading in verse 3 this time to get a little running start. Actually, let's just start reading in verse 1. It says, Now this is the commandment, the statutes, and the judgments which Yahweh your God has commanded me to teach you, that you might do it in the land where you're going over to possess it, so that you and your sons and your grandsons might fear Yahweh your God and keep his statutes and his commandments, which I am commanding you, all the days of your life, and your days will be prolonged. O Israel, you shall listen and be careful to do it, that it may be well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, just as Yahweh, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. You shall love Yahweh your God with all of your heart, and with all of your soul, and with all of your might. These words, which I am commanding you today, shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons. You shall speak of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as phylacteries between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. And so right here, in the center of Moses' plead with them, is a reminder to love Yahweh God. But not just love, also to hear, or to hear, O Israel, to shema, to listen, and as on the screen above, to listen or to obey. And again, another self-deprecating example, and I've used this one before, but there's a home video where my mom's recording me and my sister, like sitting on the mantle around Christmas time or something. I can't remember exactly. And my sister's like doing something with some toy or something. And then I'm like reaching over and I'm going to touch like the light socket. And my mom says, Andrew, she's just like, don't touch that. And then I like proceed to look at the camera, move towards it again. And then like the camera shuts off. And it's like, it's really intense. But no, thankfully my mom was passionate and compassionate. So justice was done. But was I Shema? Was I listening to my mom in that moment? The word Shema is not just about the invisible action of receiving information in your ears and it going into your mind. It's about also doing it. Going out and acting out what you are hearing. That's the word obey. It's more, maybe it would be better in our translation as obey. Because it's not just the action of receiving information into your mind, but then acting it out into the real world, embodying the command. That's Shema. That's when you Shema something. And so that is what Moses is calling on all Israel to do. And again, just to link back into chapter 4, if you want to put your finger there in chapter 6, this is chapter 4, in verse 5 and 6. He says, See, I've taught you the statutes and judgments, just as Yahweh my God commanded me, that you shall do thus in the land where you are entering to possess them. You shall keep and do them. For that is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of all the peoples. Well, they will hear these statutes, and they will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as is Yahweh our God whenever we call to him? Or what great nation is there that his statutes and his judgments is righteous as this whole law which I am setting before you today? And then if you want to go back to chapter 6. But you see that the mission that they were called to do is God's commands that he was giving them were like for their good, for life, and not just for them, but then to like be acted out and displayed to all the nations. When they love God and keep his commandments, then everyone else can see how close and the kind of God that Yahweh is. All of the things they were supposed to know about him was supposed to be shown out into the nations. But unfortunately, as we know throughout the rest of the story, how well does that go? And then lastly, in this final section that we'll talk about this evening is remember. If you will, turn over to chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Chapter 8 and verse 1. It says, the entire commandment that I am commanding you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which Yahweh swore to give to your fathers. And you shall remember all the way which Yahweh your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that he might humble you, testing you, to know what was in your heart, whether you will keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you, and he let you be hungry, and he fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by everything which proceeds out of the mouth of Yahweh. Now that last part of verse 3, anyone, little Bible trivia, who quotes that later on? Jesus. In fact, whenever Jesus is tested, and we'll get to, we're not to him yet. He's going to be the concluding exclamation mark at the end of the lesson. But whenever we do get to him, whenever he's tested by Satan in the wilderness, every time he quotes from Deuteronomy, which is just a little interesting tidbit there. When he's in the wilderness, these are the verses that come to his mind from this book. But where we're at right now with Moses speaking to the children of Israel, in this final section, it's kind of a callback, if you notice, a quick little summary of their history in those first few verses. Because Moses here is reminding them of everything that's come before this. Everything that he's brought them up to this moment. He's saying, don't forget. Don't forget the wilderness. Don't forget all of the testing that is done, because he was trying to see if you would trust him. Would you trust him to live by the daily bread that he gave them? But not by that bread, but by the word that promised that bread. The word from the mouth of Yahweh. Remember what God has done for you. And then turn a page over to the end of chapter 8. Chapter 8, verses 18 through 20. He says, but you shall remember Yahweh your God, for it is he who is giving you power to make wealth, that he may confirm his covenant which he swore to your fathers, as it is to this day. Now it will be, if you ever forget Yahweh your God, and walk after other gods, and serve them and worship them, I testify against you today that you will surely perish. Like the nations that Yahweh makes to perish before you, so you shall perish, because you would not listen to the voice of Yahweh your God. Did you catch all the things that we've been talking about thus far in that last little section? The covenant that he made with them because of his deliverance and rescue and bringing them out from the bondage of Pharaoh. And then if they choose to walk after the other gods, instead of, what did he say in chapter 6? Read this commandments as you walk by the way and as you walk in the promised land. If they choose to walk after those other gods and act like those other nations, then he says, I will treat you like those other nations. The ones that you're going to dispossess from the land, I will dispossess the land from you. And so then, if you will, turn towards the end of this section, because this is how Moses concludes this first speech, and then also how he concludes the next kind of middle section as well. All of each like of these three sections of Deuteronomy conclude with this calling. So in chapter 11, verse 26, he says, see, I'm setting before you today blessing and curse. The blessing, if you listen, if you shema, to the commands of Yahweh your God, which I'm commanding you today, and the curse, if you do not listen, shema, to the commandments of Yahweh your God, but you turn aside from the way not walking in his ways, the way which I am commanding you today, but you walk after other gods which you have not known, instead of knowing Yahweh their God. And it will be when Yahweh your God brings you into the land that you are entering to possess it, that you shall set the blessing and the curse on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. That's a little teaser for later. But go ahead, get a reading plan, keep reading, and that'll show up later. And then it will be verse 30, are they not across the Jordan west and the way upward towards the sunset in the land of the Canaanites who live in Arabia opposite Gilgal, beside the oaks of Moreh? For you are about to cross the Jordan to go and to possess the land which Yahweh your God is giving you. You shall possess it and live in it. You shall be careful to do all the statutes and the judgment which I am setting before you today. Notice how God's will for them and also what they're supposed to do overlap in that moment. It says that who's giving them the land? Yahweh is. Their God is. But does that mean it's just going to happen? No, they have to go into the land and do and follow and let him lead them into conquest, victory to victory. And in a similar way, the covenant that they're in with God. Is it just a covenant that there's just, there it is, I'm in this covenant? No, it means there's binding practices. There's these commandments. There's all these testimonies that God's given them to have life in the covenant, to live and to flourish for their good, and then to represent his goodness to all the nations. This is the setup as we're about to enter into the promised land. And it's good and it's hopeful because where did the story begin? I mean, even before the Exodus, all the way back there in the garden, they were put in a fruitful land. Adam and Eve were. A garden that they were told to tend and to keep, which means to guard and to cultivate. Just like now they're being commanded on the foot of a new Eden, a new promised land where they have a new commandments. And it's not just two humans, but a whole nation of people that are now invited into the family of God, a covenant with him. And it's this is the plot tension. So I'm trying to also convince you to get a read-through of the Bible plan at the same time with this lesson. But as we go forward and we keep reading, the question is, are they going to do this? Are they going to listen, obey Yahweh their God, the God that they know, the God that's rescued them, that's delivered them from Egypt, is passionate, compassionate, and that has given them good commands, called them to listen and obey? Are they going to do it? No, they don't. But that's where we get to the good news of this lesson. Because, like I said, I want to end with the one who did what Moses was calling on them to do here and paved the way into life. Because if you will, turn over to, you can start heading to John chapter 15. John chapter 15. I realize also just kind of funny because I was mentioning just strange habits that I have where I have a weather report. But I've also noticed that I kind of sit on the front row before a lesson and look at the passages that I've already laid out. And it's kind of I don't know, it had the same feeling as when you go to the airport and you are an hour early and you go to your gate and you just look to make sure it's there and then you go to the bathroom or something. It's I go to these passages before the lesson. It's just checking to make sure they're still there. They're still there. And then go on to do the lesson. But this is one of those ones I was looking at, and also it's kind of helpful to look at them again because it's every time something else jumps out. But here in John chapter 15, before we dive into the words of Jesus, Jesus claimed to be the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. He is those commands, the wisdom of God, his full will embodied, incarnated. And so that command of loving their God, but also listening, is completely fulfilled and lived out in the life of Jesus the Messiah. And then like Moses' last words to the children of Israel was, choose life. Love the Lord your God. Listen and obey his commands. Listen to the words of Jesus now, here in John chapter 15, beginning in verse 10. Let's start in verse 10. He says, this is Jesus speaking to his disciples at the Last Supper, which, again, the Last Supper. This is what he's saying to them right before he goes to die. And so right before the end of his life, just like Moses, what does Jesus remind his disciples? He says, verse 10, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I've spoken to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another. just as I have loved you. Greater love hath no one than this, than one lay down his life for his friends. He says, you are my friends, if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you slaves, for the slave does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all things that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. And you did not choose me, but I chose you, and appointed you that you would go and to bear fruit. Garden language. And that your fruit would abide, so that whatever you ask of the Father in my name, he will give to you. This I command you, that you love one another. And so just like Moses on top of that mountain, when it comes down to what's the heart, like what's the core thing that he wants to get across right before he dies? It's like love one another. And then if you look maybe it's same opening in my Bible, but in chapter 14 and verse 15, it's like repeated over and over again. He says, if you love me, this is 14 verse 15, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And then lastly, as we consider these passages in the words of Christ, is to obey and to love are just two sides of the same coin. Because again, we live in a world where we have many years ago, there was a guy who said, I think, therefore I am, right? That's not entirely true. Because what does these tell me? What does this tell us? What have we been thinking about? It's not just about the invisible action, or like the idea of information entering my mind that is the meat and potatoes. What you are is what you actually do. And so my love for God is not just an emotional, invisible thing that happens. Love in the Bible is something that's displayed. Obedience to God, to have faith in him, is not something that's just an invisible action that happens. It's something that's displayed. And what is the ultimate displaying of that? What is the ultimate display of love and obedience and surrender to God? It's what Jesus goes on to do after he said these last words to his disciples. For the cross. That is the ultimate display of keeping the command of God. Fully surrender in love to him and in love to others. And so then, if you want to keep turning your Bibles over to 2 John, that's where we'll end this evening. But as we look at this story, I said we'd come back to this. Where are we at on this timeline? Are we in the promised land yet? No. Have we been liberated and brought through the waters of death to the other side? Well, hopefully. If you're in Christ, you've passed through the waters and you're in new life on the other side. So like these words that Moses has been speaking are really, they're just as applicable to us today. Like we are the new Israel in a covenant with God on the edge of the promised land. And it's like, what are we going to do? What's the choice that we're going to make? And the choice is that Moses pleads with us, and that even like Christ also said is like, choose life, choose to obey, choose to love and keep his commandments. And that phrase, if you love me, you will keep my commandments, what I want to make sure we don't hear as well, is that it's not keep my commandments if you love me. Like God, again, he's not insecure. Like he's not asking you to try to like a insecure like spouse. It's like, well, if you loved me, you would do this. No, it's about first things first. It's like, if you love me, then you're going to keep my commandments. Like they're inseparable. To love and to obey are bound together. And so now, if you will, we'll end here at 2 John. Yeah, 2 John, it doesn't have chapters. It's only one short book. Just the book of 2 John, the first verses 4 through 6. 2 John, it's very, very tiny book. It's very hard to find. There it is. Okay. 2 John, chapter 1, beginning reading in verse 4. I think you'll see how everything we've been talking about just weaves itself together beautifully here. He says, I rejoice greatly to find some of your children walking in the way, in the truth, and just as we have received the commandment from the Father. And then now I ask you, lady, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but the one which we've heard from the beginning. Right? What did Moses plead with them? That we love one another. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. And this is the commandment that you've heard from the beginning, that you may walk in it. And so what is the way? What is the obeying? What is loving? It's walking according to his command. Like they all flow together in him. The narrow way of Christ. The way of love that looks like giving up of yourself on the cross. And so as we conclude, just something, that's a challenge. Like loving genuinely, loving with all of your heart, mind, and strength, loving God and loving others that way is challenging. As it says actually just on the page over in my Bible, in 1 John chapter 4, verse 20, it says, if someone says, I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar. For if one does not love his brother whom he's seen, he cannot love God who he has not seen. And this is the commandment we have from him, that the one who loves God should love his brother also. So it's just a challenge, because how we love our brothers and our neighbors is also how we love God. And how we love God is how we love our neighbor. So I invite, as well as Chuck had a great lesson on prayer, and prayer is always something kind of challenging. But here's a prayer that I think we can take with us, and if we're brave enough to pray it, is, who in my life should I be loving better? And that's a terrifying prayer to pray, because I guarantee you it will be answered, because it's definitely in line with the will of God. Because his will is for our good and to keep his commandments. And his commandments, as Christ says, are not burdensome. And so, as we wrap up here this evening, if there's anyone here, this has been a lesson spoken at Deuteronomy to people who are already in a covenant with God. And so, primarily, I've been addressing those of us who have already committed our lives to Jesus and have entered into a covenant with him. But if there's anyone here this evening who hasn't entered into Christ yet, has not been baptized into his body, we invite you to do that now this evening. It's a challenging thing. This is a heavy burden to bear. But his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And this is the way into life, to surrender completely to him in love. And if there's anyone who's wandered away from him and you've stopped doing this, now is the time to turn back to him as well. And then for all of us who are in him, who are in a covenant with him, keep walking, keep embodying his commandment. Because just like Christ was the incarnation of the law and the prophets, if we're in him, that's the call of us now. And we're to wear and walk in all of his ways.